This is episode 404 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. Carol Swaim. She is a retired professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University and frequently appears on television and other media outlets discussing especially the issue of today, which is critical race theory and race relations in the United States. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico,
Thank
Carol.
you so much. It's an honor.
Yeah, well, it's an honor to talk to you, and you've obviously been a prominent voice on these issues. But before we get started, as one political science major, thank you for your service in the field of political science and trying to study American politics and educate all those political scientists out there.
Well, I never knew that political science would take the path that it's taken, the direction that I see it moving into.
Well, I think there's a lot of aspects of the United States that we never saw quite going down the path that they have. Uh, so before you are an African American woman. You've got a long record in teaching and in academia. Why don't you just share a little bit about yourself and eventually what caught your interest in this particular area of issues?
Well, I can tell you that today's the message that you see often that comes from progressives is that people like me don't exist, or that the story that is my life, that it's impossible. I was one of 12 children, born and raised in rural poverty in southwestern Virginia, spent the early part of my life in a two-room shack, no indoor plumbing, not even an outdoor outhouse, and we missed a lot of school. I dropped out of school after completing the eighth grade. Married at 16, not because I was pregnant. I saw that as a way to get out of the house, and so I started my own family. By the time I was 20, I had three small children. I ended up getting a high school equivalency, going to a community college, and getting the first of five college and university degrees. With my bachelor's degree, I graduated magna cum laude and never sought to become a university professor. I was steered into that direction. I was a very good student, and also as a professor at Princeton, I received a signing bonus. I got offers everywhere I interviewed, except one school that didn't make an offer to me. But at that time, I had maybe seven offers, and including the one from Princeton. I went to Princeton. I got early tenure, won national prizes. I have lived and experienced the American dream. I'm not a victim. I believe in America that it remains true that if you work hard, if you learn from your mistakes, if you take responsibility for your actions, that you can be successful and that most people want you to be successful.
That's quite a story and something that definitely I can agree with you. Really exemplifies the American dream. So, congratulations for all of those accomplishments, and that I can imagine clearly impacted your views in terms of your your views on race relations in the
Yes.
United States as a whole. But did you kind of come to those early on? Was there a moment in your career that you realized that maybe some of the things you were being told or the way race relations in this country were being portrayed wasn't necessarily accurate? Like, did you work your way up with those viewpoints
Well,
intact?
I can tell you that I never saw myself as a victim because, okay, I'm poor, I'm black, part of the time a single mom because I divorced, a woman. The world would say, even then, that I was a victim. I didn't get those messages from my mentors, and many of my mentors were white. Many of them were white men. They didn't treat me like a victim. They held me to the same standards. I had to work very hard. When I got to graduate school, things changed. That's when I truly learned that I was black, I'm poor, I'm a woman, I can't do anything. But by then it was too late. I had already become a success.
And academia, though, is not. I hate to break. I know you know this, but academia and the real world are two very different things. And progressing in academia is, it's a political adventure,
It is.
and your views are not those of
Well, I have to tell you
academia,
this.
at least in general. Okay.
Okay. When I was a graduate student and a young professor at Princeton, and I was a Democrat, I never saw the world quite like everyone else. And so my work got attention because I just had a different set of ideas. But I was not a, a, a Christian in a sense. I was more of agnostic. I kind of fit in and I kind of bought what they were selling. But I was always into a meritocracy, and I refused to apply to any positions that were minority positions. And during the time I was on the job market, they had some jobs where uh, it would be advertised as a minority position, and minorities, they would uh, invite three people in for interviews, and they would take the best minority. I refused to participate in that. I only applied for jobs uh, with the general population, like if it was American politics or congressional studies, which was my field. I only applied for those jobs. I did not want to compete with just black people.
But you didn't feel like, set aside African American woman, et cetera, et cetera. Your views did not create a discriminatory process, or did
Maybe
that
I was
start it?
more like everyone else. I always questioned affirmative action
Okay.
because I felt like it was harmful to blacks. Uh, and I saw some black people when I was in school that believed that because of affirmative action that they were entitled to something. I saw others that felt like without affirmative action that we couldn't do anything. And also, I experienced myself as a black woman. There were many times that white men said to me, "Boy, I wish I was a black woman. You have it made." And I knew I was working really hard, and I didn't like the fact that some people assumed that just because I was a black woman that things were going to be a lot easier for me. I did not like the fact that there were some blacks that came from very affluent backgrounds. They didn't come from my poverty. They were not doing well in school. You know, they may be flunking out, but they told me they were going to be doctors and lawyers because of affirmative action. They were very open about that. And when I had my own children, I mean, I already had my children. So I had my children while I was in school, but I never wanted them to believe that because of affirmative action, they had to be less good. I wanted them to be the best that they could be. And I felt that some affirmative action programs disincentivized hard work. So in academia, I held those views. I felt that if you were going to have affirmative action, it needed to be need based, not color based, and that merit had to be part of it, and that it should not be a heavy thumb on the scale. I'm black, I'm Hispanic, I'm Native American, I'm a woman. I just show up. There had to be more to it, and so if those views were controversial, that's as far as I was back then. I did not become truly the views that I hold today are views that have matured as I've grown older. And I believe that critical race theory is the number one civil rights issue of our time, and that it is a crippling form of racism, that it hurts racial and ethnic minorities as much as it hurts white people, that it's hurting all of our children, and that it's a violation of our civil rights laws as well as the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution.
Yeah, very good. I just the nexus there between the higher education system and being in that system, and critical race theory, which is a creature of that system.
I hate that system. You know something? I think some of the worst ideas in our society have come from academia. And academia, like I was a tenured professor, I was paid very well. It's a great gig. It's a great gig if you can get it. And you're paid to sit around and come up with ideas. And these ideas can be flawed. The more provocative, the more attention they get. And what's dangerous is ideas like CRT come from the university and they seep down into the culture, and they're not being taught as if they're a theory. They're still a theory. They're being taught and received by some of the public as if they were
Right.
facts.
So let's talk specifically about critical race theory and its development, and it does come from academia. Uh, just as setting the ground rules here, if you will. What is CRT and how did it develop? In as kind of straightforward a story as possible, because I know it's got a long history.
It is complex, and I have a whole book on it for lay people called Black Eye for America: How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House, and the house is our home, America. And critical race theory, came out of the universities. It's one of many different critical theories because there's critical queer theory, critical feminist theory, but critical race theory, it builds on cultural Marxism. And so we can talk about, most people have heard of Karl Marx. Some of the people that have gone through the university system, they've heard the name Antonio Gramsci. Well, critical race theory itself was popularized pretty much by Dirk Bell. He was Harvard University's first tenured black law professor, and he believed that white people had pretty much structured society to benefit themselves at the expense of other groups. And that the civil rights movement, all of the things that I would point to as great moments in American history, he would say that there was white people trying to preserve their power. Critical race theory divides the world into white oppressors and minority victims. It argues that only white people can be racist, that white people have to engage in this permanent work of becoming anti-racist. No other group can be racist, and that all minorities, regardless of where they come from, they can be the child of a billionaire, that they're victims. And that white people have this never ending obligation to work on their anti racism to liberate the other groups.
Yeah, and the roots of critical theory, which, as you said, that it applies to a lot of different things. That is out of the Frankfurt School, and it's an inherently Marxian approach
Right.
to political science and to society.
And also, it has elements of postmodernism. And when we say postmodernism, like most people may not know what that is, but this whole idea that everything is relative. There's no objective truths. You have your truth, and I have my truth. And with the political left, they have said that there were no absolute truths, but now they believe that they have absolute truths when it comes to racism, and that all whites have white privilege. All white people have undeserved benefits, even if they're poor whites, that grew up in trailer parks. Parents never finished the third grade. They're saying that these white people are more privileged than racial and ethnic minorities that come from affluent families, well educated parents. That's the lie that they're putting forth.
Now, critical race theory isn't as new as a lot of people might imagine. It's not something that just came along in the last 5 years. This has been around, what, since the 90s?
1971 was when
Okay.
Derek Bale came forth with his theory, and then there are other names like Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the concept of intersectionality. But it's so interesting about Derek Bale complaining about systemic racism and the civil rights movement. He was a privileged black person. He was tenured at Harvard University Law School, first black professor tenured there, and he had a chip on his shoulder.
Describe intersectionality, which is one of the cornerstones, I guess, of CRT.
Well, it pretty much argues that you can have multiple sources of disadvantage or marginalization, and so if you are black, female, gay, poor, then you have these multiple sources that give you and what you believe in your world great authority. And they believe that people's lived experiences, like if you're part of marginalized groups, and the more boxes you can check, if you can check black, female, I came from poverty, LGBTQ, whatever. If I can check all those boxes,
Right.
then I have greater moral authority than anyone else, and you should just be quiet and listen to me because my lived experiences trumps your science. It trumps history. It trumps any kind of facts that you may wield at me because there's no such thing as facts because there's nothing that's true except what they argue.
Are there groups that are higher in priority, broadly speaking, in intersectionality, like a gay white man and an African American man? Like, are there groups that take precedence in this
There's
pseudoscience?
some groups that are in and some groups that are out. And right now, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community and you can check another box, then you have more moral authority than someone who can't. I think white gay men are doing pretty well, but I think regular old black men not doing so well. Regular black women, the more boxes you can check. And if you're conservative like me or Candace Owens, we're not considered as black. In fact, we both have had people call us black white supremacists because we don't agree with their narrative about the world. We don't see ourselves as victims. We don't believe that America is systemically racist. We believe that the American dream is possible. And I personally believe that what we are teaching our young people is crippling. I believe it's a violation often of the civil rights laws and the equal protection clause of the Constitution. And it involves some shaming and bullying of children. And it shames minority students too, because even if they come from affluent backgrounds and families, they're being pointed out and singled out in the classroom and being told that they're victims. Their parents are not raising victims. Their parents want their kids to be in school, to be educated. So they're telling the minority students that they're victims. In some cases, they're segregating them. And with the white kids, they're telling them that they don't deserve anything that they have, that they have benefited, from systemic racism, and so they're trying to really shame and bully all of our children so that they can control them, so that they can indoctrinate them and fill them with the lies.
Now, my impression is that this has been a philosophy that, if not broadly applied at the university level, has certainly been present there in colleges and universities for some time.
It has, and it's taken over the schools of ed. And so even if you have teachers, if teachers have graduated from a Department of Education at most major colleges and universities, they would have been taught critical race theory. They would have been steeped in it. And it started out in the philosophy and the political science departments, but it has infected every part of the university, and it is in K through 12. And it is in the form, no, they're not teaching Dirk Bell. They're not teaching Richard Delgado. They're not teaching Karl Marx. They're not teaching it directly as such, but they have books for kids that are in first and second grade. They have movies and articles. They have teaching materials where the teachers ask certain questions or they may show something to evoke guilt. They use the social, emotional learning as a way to supposedly to create empathy where teachers, subjectively evaluate how someone's child is doing based on how well the child responds to the indoctrination. I mean, this is dangerous. It takes time away from them learning the academics, the hardcore academics that education is supposed to be about.
Now, when did that trend happen, though? Because, and maybe it's because I went to Catholic schools growing up in the early '90s. Certainly, that wasn't present in those schools as I see it. But uh, when did critical race theory really start to filter into schools beyond higher education in most schools?
Here's what I'm going to argue. And, my kids are older. They were getting some of that.
Okay.
But,
At public school? Or
yeah, public
okay.
schools. But when the Obama administration, when they came into power, their Department of Education focused on things like restorative justice, and that resulted in changes within the school system that made it difficult for teachers to get rid of violent kids in the classroom if a kid was black and they were disrupting the classroom, all of a sudden they were not supposed to suspend those children. And sometimes those children ended up injuring teachers as well as other classmates. And it also was part of the criminal justice system where kids that repeatedly committed crimes were sent back home until they finally, killed someone or were apprehended for engaging in a violent robbery, and then the system would begin to interact with them. But by the time the system really got involved, the kid would have committed numerous crimes. I would say that I noticed it during the Obama administration. As a professor in academia, my life started to change during the Obama administration, particularly during the second term, when you got this big push for political correctness, safe spaces, trigger warnings, personal pronouns. All of these things made it more difficult for professors. And I saw the university stop pretending to be a marketplace of ideas, and they became indoctrination centers where the inmates, and the inmates are the students, they're running the prison, and the professors and the administrators are drawing six-figure salaries. And some of the professors who may not agree, they're afraid to say anything. The administrators are fueling it. And I think that many of those administrators and college presidents are people that are steeped in the Saul Alinsky tactics that we find in the book Rules for Radicals, and that much of what you see taking place in our government today, that's where it comes from. And this is not about educating our kids. It's not about racial reconciliation, bringing people together. Marxism is steeped in conflict theory. It's about dividing people. It's divisive. And I know that here in New Mexico, that the Department of Education, that some of the things that they're pushing through social studies are very divisive. And they believe that Hispanics are victims of systemic racism, and they're pushing the LGBTQ agenda. All of that is part of critical theory. Critical theory is steeped in the Marxism and the postmodernism. It's not going to bring about racial reconciliation or healing. It's not going to help our children to become better citizens or to be educated.
Yeah, it just one of the things that I think makes this whole discussion so challenging for average people, but it really is a result of the Marxist uh, roots of the critical race theories. The language, there's a lot of terms that are either manipulated in the way they're applied, or the difference between equality and equity and those kinds of things. But you just threw out a bunch of terms that are hard to define. If we could sit here for 45 minutes just defining terms, but
Right.
talk about the manipulation of language and some of the red flags that people should
Well,
look for.
the power does come through the use of language, and the left, they're very skilled with that. Just think about Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. That is a truth statement. That is a slogan. That's an organization, and so they use that. If you don't say Black Lives Matter, then you're a racist. And
Or
so
if you say all lives matter.
yeah, if you say all lives matter, if you say white lives matter, that's a twist on words. But diversity today doesn't mean what diversity meant 10 years ago. We I don't think any Americans I know are against diversity, because diversity itself, the whole universe is diverse, but they are talking about privileging certain groups because they belong to a particular race or ethnicity or sexual orientation. Their diversity is not the same as just bringing in different kinds of people. Their inclusion is not about having a workforce or a school that has people from different backgrounds. They want people to be included, to have their little affinity groups where they segregate themselves and they make their demands within the workplace, within the school. That's their inclusion. And when they're talking about equity, they're not talking about equal opportunity, non discrimination. They want equal outcomes. They want you to show up if you're a member of one of the marginalized groups, you're supposed to get the same thing as someone who's worked for 20 years. It's supposed to be handed to you. That's a change in the meaning of words. And they play word games all the time. Some people will say, we're not doing critical race theory, we're doing culturally sensitive learning. Oh no, we're just doing civil rights. We're just doing social justice. They twist and play with words all the time. But if it is demeaning one group because of who they are, if it's a school that's saying that white people are to blame for all the problems of the world and the race and the conditions of other ethnic minorities, and that's the only reason why these people may not have, that there are disparities. I mean, that's a form of critical race theory. If they're saying that all men are chauvinistic, and that it's a male dominated society, and that women are victims, that's a form of critical theory. If they're saying, that heterosexuals are oppressive and that all homosexuals and transgenders, that these people are victims, that's a critical theory. And so this social emotional learning, it works hand in hand with critical theory, because one part indoctrinates and then the other part uh, allows teachers to decide whether or not your child is normal based on if they go along with the indoctrination.
Could you is that the definition of social emotional learning, or what could you define that? Because that's one I'm somewhat familiar with, but I know it's a term that's used at Albuquerque public schools and their
It
training.
has changed meaning too, because when it first came out, it seemed like it would be positive because they were trying to teach young people to deal with their emotions. And so, maybe kids came from certain backgrounds and they didn't know how to handle stress. And I think it started off planning to be a way that you would teach kids to deal with their emotions. That's how it was first sold.
Right.
But now it means something different. It means that they are trying to create empathy towards certain groups. And so if you're a white male and you're not feeling great empathy, for what they're telling you about the plight of these other groups that your ancestors have harmed, you could be evaluated in a way that would affect you by a teacher that's saying that you're not balanced because you don't have sufficient empathy.
And
And so a lot of the things that have been around for a while, they don't mean what they used to mean.
just adds more complexity to the whole discussion. And disparate impacts, another one. You talked about Obama and the administration and kids getting disciplined. Uh, disparate impacts is another
Yeah,
tool of art.
a legal. That's a legal term. That came out in the '70s. A law case, Griggs versus Duke Power. But what the political left has done is they've looked at the socioeconomic disparities you see between groups, between racial and ethnic groups, and they've attributed all of that to racism, as opposed to looking at how different cultures operate, the choices they may make, the jobs they may lean towards. And what CRT has done, they focus a lot, such as with Black Lives Matter, on the incarceration rate of minorities, whether it's blacks or Hispanics, more of them are in prison or jail, but they don't focus on the fact that they're actually committing more crimes. And there's a reason why they're in jail, or why they're having these unfortunate encounters with the law enforcement. And there's some certain messages that seem to say it's okay to resist a lawful police officer. If you are resisting arrest, that doesn't normally turn out well. I mean, when a police officer stops me, and it's not very often that I've been stopped. I think I've had 2 speeding tickets in my life, but I'm assuming that I must have done something. He's not just stopping me because I'm black. And I think that we are sending the message to young blacks and Hispanics that the police officer is stopping you because of the color of your skin, and you don't have to obey what they're telling you. And we're reaching a point where there's no place for individual responsibility. The conditions of racial and ethnic minorities, we're not looking at how do we make it better for these groups. What things can you do within your community to improve your situation? With CRT, all the blame is placed on white people. The responsibility for what you can do, like for myself, I worked, I went to college, I had a vision, I had a dream. That's still out there, that's still possible, but we're telling people that the world is the country is systemically racist. It everything works against you. If I had gotten those messages as a child, I don't even know that I would have gotten out of bed. Would I still be in rural poverty in southwestern Virginia? I don't know, but I wasn't taught those lies.
And I've seen disparate impact applied to classrooms as well, where if you have more kids who are African American or Hispanic who are getting in trouble, that's somehow a sign of racism because they're causing more problems, but that's causing more of those disciplinary
But
actions to be
everything
had
is,
against.
according to the political left,
Right.
everything can be attributed to racism. Everything is about racism. It's not about individual people making choices.
Now, briefly, and we can't go through all of it, but these social studies standards that New Mexico has embraced, and New Mexico, of course, Hispanics are an interesting group because they're, on one hand, with regard to whites, they're told they're a downtrodden minority,
But
but
they are white. I mean, that Hispanic is not a race.
that that is an accurate statement. Yeah, from the Census Bureau. Yeah, but that's a you just blew my mind. But yeah, there is a statement in these social studies standards about teaching young people in school, and I don't. It had to do with the seventh grade students must compare the patterns of exploration, destruction, and occupation of the Americans by the Spaniards. So whatever role Hispanics play in all this, they're often seen as the victim, and in New Mexico, they're sometimes the quote unquote oppressor. It's a fascinating issue because in critical race theory, it seems to be that whatever the group dynamic is, it can be changed based on their political preferences. Basically, is that it just manipulate the whole process. Like you said, you're not African American because you're a
Yeah,
conservative.
they're saying that pretty much if you are black and Hispanic, and so Hispanic is not a race, but you can be black or you can be white or you can be within those groups. But I'm sorry, what were you saying?
It just seems that under this critical race theory framework, they manipulate not just the language but the various groups and whether they are considered oppressed or oppressor
But mostly
for
with
whatever.
the critical race theory that I have seen, white people are always labeled as the oppressors, and the minorities are always the victims, no matter how affluent they are. And it's the argument pretty much is that when you see people that have wealth or people that have been successful, they don't deserve that. And I think that that is a dangerous message to send to young people.
Yeah,
And as far as their social studies curriculum, would those children benefit more by being taught more math
right.
or more science or more reading comprehension or just any of a number of practical skills? What's happening in America, I believe, is that we're focused so much on the social engineering and the soft, squishy theories. Children around the world, where they're actually teaching hardcore academics, they are outshining American students. And this is not just taking place in the public schools, this is also taking place in private elite schools, in Christian schools, and it's very dangerous. And I think it's being pushed by one particular political party, and that is the Democrats. They're pushing it, and it's not making our society better off as a consequence.
Right. And I guess to kind of clarify what I was saying is that you have Hispanics in New Mexico, governor on down, members of the Senate, the Congress, and definitely positions of power.
Hispanics have done very well in New Mexico, and they're not victims, and and so they should be very proud of the success that Hispanics have achieved in this state, but also in this nation.
Yeah.
And I would not want to send a message to young Hispanics or young Native Americans or young blacks that they're victims in any sort of way.
All right. Well, we only have a few minutes remaining, and I want to talk solutions and ways that average people can push back against this. Of course, we tried. Rio Grande Foundation really led the effort to provide feedback and testimony against these rules. Of course, they shoved them through. The governor on down shoved these things through. It's not the only example of critical race theory, but it's one of the more prominent ones that we see in New Mexico. How do we push back against this in our daily lives, in our schools, etc.?
First of all, I think it's a very dangerous thing too that in many states they're using the Department of Education, because we have the federal Department of Education. They're using the state Department of Education to strip power away from local communities. And I think that parents and families and teachers need to stand up, support their school board members, and elect school board members that will stand up for their children, because the parent is the one that's responsible for their children. And parents need to realize that they do have power. Another thing is, I think they should always remember that CRT, uh, it what they're pushing runs counter to our civil rights laws and to our Constitution, and they should question the legality of what's taken place. And they need to learn more about CRT, and that's the reason that I wrote the co-authored book Black Eye for America: How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. And that's a book that is written for lay people. It explains what CRT is, where it came from, how it impacts our society, why it's anti-Christian, anti-civil rights, anti-constitution. It has 2 chapters on how to fight back, and it has appendices. It has a glossary, because they are always changing the language. And I think that if someone takes the time to read that book, and you could read it in a couple of hours, you need to study it though. That would take longer. I think you would be well equipped to be able to stand up and push back, and we have to stand up and push back.
Uh, just anything else you want to bring up as we conclude? Did I miss any questions or pertinent issues that you feel need to be addressed before we conclude the conversation?
Well, I am, in New Mexico as we speak, and I'm going to be speaking this afternoon. And I would urge people, if you're interested in what I think and more of what I have to say, to go to my website, sign up for a newsletter. And I'm on Facebook as Dr. Carol M. Swain. I'm on Twitter at Carol M. Swain. I'm on Instagram and various other social media. And I would encourage them, email me at carolimswain@gmail.com, and keep fighting, and trust your gut. There's something very wrong with what's taking place.
All right. Well, thank you for your time this afternoon, Dr. Carol Swaim, and I urge people to check out that information available online and check out her book as well. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.